Welcome back to Follow the Rabbit. Thanks you for joining us, and we're kind of very thrilled to introduce our guest to the podcast, Chris Palmieri from Japan. I want to start with the fact that Chris and us have met, I think, like a decade ago, once in person. Shout out to Boris Anthony for making this happen. And we weirdly never met after again. I don't think we even have ever communicated extensively after that via email. But I think there is something about the magic of the internet that is kind of part of this particular episode. Because without the ambient intimacy of Twitter and now LinkedIn, maybe, we would not be sitting here together and talking about third places. But since we do, and we're thrilled about this, here's a little bit of context about Chris. Chris has been the co-founder of AQ that is based in Tokyo and Paris. They're a design product studio working with companies like Google and Mercari and Panasonic, and have been involved in all kinds of really interesting projects over the last 20 years. And we are super thrilled that Chris will join us here on the podcast to discuss third places in Japan because, well, we are not in Japan, Johannes and I at least. And while we can obviously use a lot of the internet resources available to us, it's always a really great pleasure to have someone who is local and really understands the kind of situation there. And we'll be sharing, and Chris will be sharing his research and kind of understanding of third places. And we'll discuss how this connects to the research that we have been sharing before. Chris, did I forget anything?
Uh, Maybe I'd like to add that today I come here mainly as a resident of Tokyo and also someone interested in the history of design and how the history of design causes certain loops and effects in the city. Um, so what I have to present here is really like man on the street observations of how the city that I call home has evolved and uh, the places available to me and my family and my friends have evolved across multiple kind of like epoch changing events that have happened since I moved here in 2001. And I'm really interested in what Johannes and you, Igor, find interesting about all of this. As you'll see in a moment, I'm at the stage of basically doing a raw mapping, like an inventory of what is available in the city and trying to pick up on patterns and shifts. And I don't know what the hypothesis is that I'm chasing, or like the big question is that I can't answer here. Um, but I come to you and your audience mainly with data.
Well, I think that's very much in the Robin Sloan kind of alley of things that we're doing here as well. The point is to research, not to really the conclusion, I guess. But with that in mind, thank you for doing this with us. And I will hand it over to you. And as agreed before, or we'll be interrupting when needed. But other than that, we'll curious to hear what you found so far and have a conversation about it.
Right. Okay. Well, let me start by quickly explaining how this map is organized. I've made an inventory of as many genre of third places as I could come up with, and then tried to map different uses, like permitted uses of these spaces in these white circles, and then group them roughly into neighborhoods of function. And then I have a couple of specific case studies that I think represent one member of the species of whatever that genre is. And then here I've started to map out some timeline of historical context that might explain some of this. And then a case study from film, which I want to talk about a little bit today. And then also going back to Oldenburg's founding characteristics of a third place, like really interrogating to what degree the places I've mapped fit that definition, and if not, like what are we talking about here? What is the local Japan specific or Tokyo specific adaptation? So that's
Cool.
an overview. Yeah, Japanese culture is famous from starting from overview, so excuse the convention. But yeah, jumping into a couple of the trends that I see now that I've mapped all this out. There's one which dates back, I would say, to the post-war period, when Japan was rebuilding its cities, which were demolished in the war, and building up the manufacturing-based economy, building up the middle class. And this is around the functions of third places being co-opted and kind of brought into the home as functions that, often are embodied as appliances. So, for centuries before the war, you had public baths, which were a very low-cost way for people of the community to meet and bathe, converse, build relationships, kill time, and rest, etc. And starting into the 1950s, with the rise of public housing, suddenly you have baths available in the home to middle-class families, and you can kind of mark the decline of public baths. They still exist, but not in the same numbers as they once did. As you have home baths, you can see the same thing with something like a well, which before the war, we had wells even in the cities where neighbors would share a water source to do their washing and conversing, etc. And then with the rise of white appliances after the war, you have washing machines in the home. And so there's like a social function of the well, which has kind of eroded or been displaced somewhere else.
Less of an like interruption, but actually like a mental note, I think, for Johannes and I, maybe to look into this, like what if is there a parallel for this in Germany? Because like, I mean, obviously after the war, like there are parallels between both Japan and Germany, but I think like it would be interesting to kind of like see if there's like what is the equivalent of German, like, because public baths aren't really, at least in my knowledge, weren't a big thing. But like the parallel between also washing machines and that kind of like culture of engineering as well, I think like might be a good and interesting kind of like side track for us to explore as well. So yeah.
Yeah. I'd be curious to know the answer. Yeah, so just to keep on this, on the public bath note, a more recent take on the public bath actually opened up in the neighborhood where I'm joining you from today, in Harajuku. So there's a big mixed-use development building that popped up on one of the major intersections here, which includes a co-working space and office space, as well as multiple floors of retail and restaurants. I think there's a Dior boutique on the ground floor, etc. And funnily enough, the developers decided to put a public bath in the basement of this building, and have a lot of questions about the decision to not have a first floor entrance. But it's an interesting aesthetic choice, and I wonder, for a place which, like Harajuku, which is not primarily residential, it is mainly a commercial place. Like, what does it mean to have a public bath? Like, who has the right to use this space, or like to whom is it actually useful and appealing? It just opened, so I don't know the answer. I have not visited, only to check it out, not to actually bathe. So don't have a lot of data here, but you can see in something like this public bath, kind of a longing for a time that's long past. Like it's a nod to forms of gathering that are no longer the dominant one. And
Hey,
it's
to add one thing to that, what I find really interesting from your observations is there's always like there's a cringiness and uncanniness in these like
mm,
super commercial developments that are trying to pick up on trends and also connect to things, but never really quite manage it. For me, as an like cultural observer, they are always actually kind of helpful because they make it easier to identify what was interesting or what was the thing that made the original thing. Like you said, like they don't have an entrance on the ground floor. It's like it's underground. And I don't know if you thought of that before or if you just like, wait a minute, something's different here. Oh, all the others have a street level entrance. Oh, I have never thought about this being actually an important aspect of it. But and I have this with a lot of others, like, why is this not quite working when I come into like a mind space, for example, or like others, like super commercial places? Why they talk about community, but it seems strange. Like I remember, like if you go into a mind space and you only seen the Instagram account mind space before, like this is definitely very different from their Instagram like world that they like propose. And I find this all actually quite helpful to better understand the original concept.
Yeah, completely. I think it's a type of uncanny valley
Yeah.
effect. Like if you had asked me before Harakato was built, please describe a public bath in Japan in a couple of words, I would have talked about the mural of Mount Fuji because this is like the iconic sign of the bath. I would have not talked about the ground level entrance, but you take it away and suddenly it becomes obvious that like having ground level visibility and this curtain that you part as you go in, and there's like a shoebox that you put your shoes in, and then you buy a ticket from this old lady who's in this like DJ booth of the onsen. All of these aesthetic details actually reveal themselves when they're not there anymore.
Mhm. But maybe like I mean I'm not going to break the fourth wall here, but by saying that we did a pre-conversation.
Mm-hmm.
What is interesting is in those concepts I think is like is it nostalgia without function? It's mimicking something that people have been used to, but like taking it apart. And I think that that applies to certain things that we obviously documented in the third place research as it is right now as well. Like third places, according to Oldenburg, were a specific thing. And a lot of the third places that are emerging right now are a lot more commercial or at least commercially driven. And that in itself creates a different kind of situation. I think that is a really great example of attempting kind of to mimic something um, with a certain kind of cultural signaling, maybe because even that space might not even be used that much, as you said, like because of the area and like who would enter that in a context. But still, it seems like a really interesting and significant aspect that it is, even if it's in a ground, like lower floor, somebody still allocated real estate to it, and that in itself has cost a significant amount of money because famously Tokyo is not a cheap real estate environment. So it's kind of, I think, like it's interesting how those decisions are being made and how that influences what third place will mean today and in the future.
Yeah, just maybe a postscript on this particular case study. The land that this building sits on was formerly occupied by a large apartment complex up until at least the 70s, probably beyond that. And this apartment complex is known to history because a lot of up and coming fashion designers, including I believe Comme des Garçons, Kawakabore,
Oh wow.
got their start there. I mean, it was fairly uh, affordable apartments, and so they would open up an atelier there and build their first collection and try to get traction, and then eventually get their boutique and so on and so forth. But that very spot of land, which I think that use it's slightly different than a third place. It's like kind of first place being reappropriated as a second place or something like that.
Yeah.
But that movement was like very organic and sort of ground up and needs based, and then eventually it fell out of use. That's fine, and it's been replaced by something which is trying to signal creativity, uh, but doing so in a very top down, like all at once way that to me feels artificial. And part of that is because of the cost of the real estate as well. Like there's just it feels moneyed, and that was not my experience of like the early days of like trying to get a creative business off of the ground. We were using scraps of real estate that nobody else wanted. Um, and you can see this pattern in other cities, throughout at least the 20th century.
Oh, we're from Berlin. We definitely see it.
Shall we move somewhere else?
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about this corner over here, which I'm labeling privacy as service, and its neighbor companionship as service, because they do not fit the classic definition of third place. To my knowledge, the original definition had an assumption that that third places are a way of gathering in a way which is where members of the community are entering on the same level. There's not sort of like this hurdle to entry, and it's a way to build new relationships, to having the serendipity of like occupying a space that is open to everyone. And I've noticed a few genres of place which don't fit that definition, but also don't fit definitions of residence or workplace either. And so I'm mapping them here to try and chew on what exactly they are. So the way I think about privacy as service, so Tokyo, as you know, is extremely dense, and homes tend to be small, office spaces tend to be small, not a lot of private offices, with like glass facades, etc. You're kind of on top of each other when you're at home and you're at work. And so there are all of these use cases that pop up where essentially you just want to get away from your colleagues and your family. Or maybe you want to relate to them in a slightly different way, although that's another part of the map. But if we look at, just trying to find solitude and do something privately, there's all of these different genres of space that you can find throughout the city. So one example that made it into the news a couple years ago was that at the dawn of car sharing services in Japan, the car sharing companies were noticing that a lot of their customers were renting the cars and then not putting any mileage on them because they were sitting in the parking lot. And they tried to figure what this was about, and found people who were using them as like little office booths, and they would rehearse their big speech or fix their PowerPoint or join a Zoom call. I've actually done this myself, in sitting in a parking lot and joining a meeting because I couldn't get back home quickly enough. And
Actually, I remember vividly researching something for a car manufacturer project and stumbling upon exactly that, and kind of like it was really fascinating because the term like third place, for like from the perspective of a car manufacturer, they kind of try to find use cases for their cars, and basically looking into the social kind of functions that even cars that just parked can have, like discussing anything from being like a security kind of space when you have like you feel threatened and you kind of like can enter a car, And so this came up, and it was I remember kind of like everyone was like, yeah, this is like exactly like car manufacturers were like, we should look into this. Like, how can we monetize that? And it's interesting because like in a dense environment, I think like the car can be a really like that space that like gives you a little bit of breathing room from from all the other people.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Like if you look at many of these in the purple color, if you were to actually take a photo of them, they kind of are all the same. It's a space that is like 1 meter wide or not even by 2 meters deep, and you can stand up in them, and there's a door, and there might be internet service. There's some degree of soundproofing. Maybe um, they are like opaque to, or like they have frosted glass, etc. And it's really just minor adjustments that dictate their purpose. So like, I don't know if this exists outside of Japan, but there are these work booths that have popped up inside of train stations mainly, although even in office building lobbies. And it's essentially the type of like phone booth that you would see in like a big office to take a call, but it's in the middle of a train station, and you step into it. You can use your usually your commuter card to pay for it. So you kind of tap in and you get in there, and there's an office chair and a desk. There's usually a little fan to keep you cool, and then place to plug in your laptop. There might be a small external screen, etc. And like functionally not that different from a car sitting in a parking lot, but differentiated by where it's located, and then also the marketing. Like what does it call itself, really? But then you see all these examples of people using them for things that are not quite what they were marketed for, and like that interplay is kind of fun. I heard from a friend recently that love hotels, which if you're not familiar, these are essentially short stay hotels that are used by uh, customers of the sex trades to go on a date for a couple of hours. But during COVID, some of the love hotels were marketing themselves to um, I don't know how to translate this properly, but basically like a girls meetup. So like 5, 6 women who get together to like chat and hang out for a couple hours, talk about the celebrity that they all love, or they might be into like a certain like otaku culture of like you know like a certain hobby, etc. And so they became these like small gathering spaces, and the price is right. Like, they're priced by the hour, their seating. I don't know what they do with the rotating bed, but like that's kind of business. It was a way for the love hotels to kind of find a new customer and a new use case and continue to have revenue coming in during a period where people were not paying for a lot of sex. Um,
It's I actually I don't know, like this is like I don't think it's very common in Europe, but I don't have like a really good grasp on, because it feels like those things are usually like more driven to the outskirts of cities, so they're not in a kind of like super accessible kind of way. And so I'm not sure if that's, and also I think like it's very much a density thing. Like at least in Berlin, it's not that much of a problem. Maybe Paris, maybe the places that are a lot more dense would be also interesting to look into.
Yeah, in Tokyo, love hotels are quite, I mean, they tend to show up in high density commercial neighborhoods. There's an area of Shibuya, which is like essentially a love hotel neighborhood. I think there's the same in Shinjuku. So a lot of the major train stations have these
Hmm.
neighborhoods. It's like a neighborhood within a neighborhood, essentially. Um, and so you have the easy access of being close to a major transportation hub, which can help the business convert to another use case. Like maybe a little bit dicey to go in the evening if you're a group of like girls, like going through a red light district, essentially. But during the daytime, not so much of a problem. I mean,
Hmm.
yeah. there's an adaptability, I think, to this city that allows these conversions to happen.
Makes sense.
Yeah, and then next to that, I have this companionship as a service. I'll skip that, but there are all these different genres of cafes, which yeah, I don't know how to categorize these or describe them properly. But of course, you have the Starbucks, right, model where you go there to chit chat with a work friend or like a childhood buddy or like to study, to work. It's really quite adaptable. But then you have these hyper differentiated offshoots of cafes like the Jazz Kissa, or like there's classical music versions of this, where you go there to quietly sit and listen to music. And so there's this kind of very specific social experience where you're in the company of other people, and you're in a service relationship with the cafe owner. But it's also solitary, right? You're there to kind of like sit by yourself. There's no conversation happening. And there's a couple things like this in Japan where it's socialization, but I don't think people are really making friendships here. Or if they are, maybe it takes them, I don't know, 10 years or
Yeah,
something.
it would
And
be
yeah.
interesting to see if. So I've seen a couple of months ago this story about what they tracked is that whenever a Starbucks opened up in a specific area that was
Mm.
underserved, for example, by coffee places, they would also see. I don't know what the exact time frame was, but basically in the development of new businesses in that area. So basically, what the Starbucks allowed for people to do is to kind of like explore an area, sit, get familiarized with it, also meet sometimes people, and then kind of imagine themselves opening a business in that area. So it's
Hmm.
basically the cafe as a springboard for an understanding of an area and the people who are usually kind of like joining you in
Mhm.
the same time. So it's kind of interesting to see if even in that solitary experience, the cafe becomes then also a third place as a kind of like springboard for the area, not necessarily the people, but kind of like as a community kind of situation.
Mhm. Yeah, I wonder if that's the case. I think when you talk about something like a jazz kissa, or um, like something that is more based in hobbies and passions, it becomes more of a destination. Um, at least in the city, like it's a place that you go to. Um, that may differ in smaller cities,
Mm.
but I think perhaps because of the density and the diversity of options available, um, like if I go to like a bar that has a really great like rock and roll vinyl selection, I have no expectation that I'm going to meet neighbors there. It's just people who are interested in that particular atmosphere, that genre of music, perhaps. Maybe they're whiskey drinkers or something. Like the vibe and like the genre become the source of gravity, perhaps,
Hmm.
rather than like the locality of it.
I read, so I think it's for me it's really interesting. I think there's a lot to learn here about the reemergence of third places that we're observing. And when we started talking about that, like one of the senses was, so during the pandemic, people and like really the rise of like virtual work. A lot of people like moved out of the city or were able to, like, because you didn't have to go to work, you could rent bigger places. So and you would just like spend more time in your first place. Um, and now, so we've said, like one of the observations was, okay, this is a very post-pandemic thing in the sense of people recognize I'm going crazy if I spend all day at home. I need to see other people. I need to be with other people. And then that might mean go back to work, but also I just want to be more part of neighborhood communities, something like that. Like the sense to belong, to like fight loneliness is like one aspect. But what I find, like we also already like thought about like, so, but also rents are going so much higher. And for Berlin, for example, I would say the problem here is not so much density. It is the problem that it's impossible to rent a larger space because it's so expensive. So people moving into smaller flats, which again means if they're mostly staying at home and then maybe at work, they're always like in condensed spaces, and they just like want to not always be in these small spaces, but want to go out, want to different. And that's what, and I find this really interesting here, looking at all these different third-ish places that you describe from Tokyo. I think they give us a glimpse of how much more diverse this ecosystem of third places may become also in a city like Berlin, because people don't want to spend so much time at home, don't want to spend too much time at work. They need other and very diverse places. And it's not only about a sense to belong and community, it's also about like what you describe as being alone together, just being there and just enjoying something, enjoying listening to a record in the cafe. And sure, it's nice that people are around, but it's not about like constantly chatting and having conversations. It's just not being in your small home or at work.
Yeah, I think the way that I think about this is that in Tokyo, like the whole city is kind of an extension of your home.
Nice.
And I mean, there are all these adaptations that make that so. Like, if you go to any convenience store, there is usually a shelf where you can get a fresh change of clothes, like a necktie. You can get a envelope that is appropriate for attending a funeral or a wedding, etc. There's these products that are really for you in various pinches. I suppose, like, I've spilled coffee all over my shirt and I have to go give a presentation. So you just get a new shirt at the convenience store. They're everywhere. And, run to the toilet and change, and you're good to go, right? Or like, you've forgotten to pick up an envelope and you're going to this party or something. Like you can kind of tell a lot about all the different pinches that people find themselves in by just going through the convenience store shelves. I really think the convenience stores are almost a part of like, it's like a part of the operating system, or like a pre-installed app of like the Tokyo operating system that we all make use of like many times a day.
I wonder, like, this is super fascinating to me because like it's I mean, I heard this before, but every time someone tells me about the convenience stores, there's like a new aspect about them that is like totally fascinating. And coming, like, I mean, we both live in Germany, and Europe, like in general, I would say is like not a super like service focused kind of like culture. Like there's like obviously degrees, but like I find that kind of like that understanding, or well, in the UX context, you would say like somebody mapped out all the possible problems that someone can have throughout the day, and realized that it would be super easy to kind of like have like 3 shirts of like each of one size, because there's like the chance that he will need multiple of them throughout the day is kind of still low, and kind of said, well, it doesn't take me any space, or it doesn't cost me anything. In the contrary, it would actually make sure that someone will walk in, get the shirt, and maybe probably something also to drink and some other stuff as well, and solve like a problem for the customer and for themselves as well. And I wonder why it is so much easier to think like that apparently in Japan, but not not very much in at least Europe and Germany. It's just an interesting thing because you would never buy a shirt in a convenience store. I mean, what a convenience store is in Europe, I think, is also quite different from what it is in Japan.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, in Tokyo, it's to the point that, like, if I have a sudden need for nearly anything, the first question I ask myself is, I wonder if I can get that at the convenience store.
Yeah.
Because they're everywhere. I can save myself a trip to something more specialized. And it will probably not be the perfect of whatever that thing is, but it gets the job done and I can get on with my day.
But then convenience places are then, I mean, you have like Converse and here, like basically there are a social function for people who live nearby, but also for anyone who kind of like is in that specific area but is not from that area. You can actually you know what you can expect from a convenience store, even if it's not your local one.
That's right. Yeah,
Okay.
There are variations, of course.
Sure.
And you're disappointed every once in a while. But then there's also local adaptations. Like if you go to a convenience store in the countryside, you can find ones that sell fireworks, which wouldn't make sense as much in Tokyo. I mean, or some ones that sell charcoal because there's a lot of people barbecuing. So there's kind of like these local variations can be both I guess a blessing and a curse depending on what it is you're looking for.
Nice.
So from what you're saying, it always sounds to me like people in Tokyo consider the whole of the city to be their third place to a certain degree. And I'm just wondering, like, do you have a sense of how then the citizens relate to their city? So is this much more? Do they feel much more of an ownership, or like really this? Like you almost mentioned, like it's an extension of their home. It's like, and thus they feel more like if somebody litters, like wait a minute, that's almost like my home or something like that. So, I don't know. Like, is there something special that you feel about how people relate to the city?
Yeah. I want to be careful not to draw big generalizations because I would be speaking for a lot of people. But I think if I just observe my own behavior and that of the people closest to me, the way that expresses itself is kind of this hyper awareness of neighbors and like not wanting to be the bad neighbor. So, for example, in our apartment complex, I'm continually reminded by my family to keep my voice down when we're in the hallway, because, like someone might be sleeping or studying or taking a call, and I think there's a duty to neighbors which is felt at the very base level as like, just wanting to be respectful of their co-ownership of these spaces, or like, that we both have rights to, say, the hallway that we share, and an expectation that like, I will help keep it clean so that it's clean for you as well. And there's more, I think, like pro-social versions or flavors of that, and others which become closer to like, sort of not censorship, but like being always like a little bit hesitant to take up too much space, or like psychic space in the spaces that you go. Maybe this would be as good a moment any to bring this case study about. It's from the world of film. So there's this Wim Wenders film that came out, I believe, last year, called Perfect Days, which is about a service worker whose job is to clean the toilets in the public parks. And the movie follows him back and forth to work and to home over the course of a handful of days. And what there's a lot that's great about this film, but what I found relevant here is that essentially you can divide the movie into two like social spaces where the character takes on different identities and has different rights to the space that he's occupying. So on the left, this is his kind of professional identity. So here he's on the west side of the city. So these are neighborhoods like Shibuya and Risu and Roppongi, etc. What is called Yamanote. And it has a slightly more like upper, not class, but like, yeah, it's a more enriched area of the city, more information workers, etc. And here he is in service of other people's enjoyment of third places, these public parks, and the restrooms that are available there. And all of the bathrooms that he's cleaned were designed by celebrated designers who were, used to market these parks. This is actually a project that Shibuya Ward has been doing for the last 4 or 5 years or so. And within these spaces, he's an anonymous service worker. He's mysterious to his coworkers. He's kind of defined by his uniform. And the themes that emerge in the movie are ones of transience, abandonment, etc. But he is also in nature, and he's able to enjoy that nature, urban nature, during his breaks, and he takes photographs, etc. So then he transitions twice a day back and forth to where he lives, which is on the east side of the city, what is known in Tokyo as Shitamachi, which is more blue collar. It's an older area of the city. And here he occupies his private space, which is an apartment building, wooden construction, quite dilapidated. His room is made from tatami mats and, wooden bookshelves, etc. And he tends to a little garden of plants inside of his house. But he's a full human being here, like he's known by name. And he also makes use of third places which are in his neighborhood. So the local public bath, the local bar, and the streets, the bridges, etc. And he has relationships with, the old men who are at the public bath, with the hostess who works at the hostess bar that he, goes to drink at, etc. And so this is for him a space of rest and leisure, but where he's like a sort of a full, like human being, like as an individual. And this is the area where the more personal relationships evolve throughout the movie. So yeah, I introduced this again, just a piece of data, or like a way that third places show up in a quite recent film. But I think you could do the same study of films going back to like Ozu in the 1950s and probably find other ways of kind of slicing the film up based on how the characters occupy different places and like what rights they have to relationships.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's one of those Wim Wenders characteristics that he is actually quite good at capturing the vibe and essence of a place, and I think he did this throughout his film career over and over again. And I think it's kind of like it reminded me also, actually, like also the way you described it, it reminded me a little bit of things that Parasite is also touching on. There are definitely parallels in that as well, but you're right, like the kind of like the portrayal of third places in movies is certainly something that we want to explore as well. So yeah, thanks for bringing up Perfect Days.
The contrast to Parasite I had not thought of, but yeah, it also has kind of this like binary, right, that they're passing back and forth among, but if I remember correctly, that movie mainly takes place in private residences.
It does. It touches a little bit on kind of like certain kind of areas, and I think that's where it's also kind of like glimpses that kind of like that. Oh, there is something else that could happen. But yeah, I mean, Parasite is like very much like I'm not sure what the English word is, like Kammerspiel. Like it's a closed in kind of like thing. So yeah. Chris, I feel like we only touched upon only like a fraction of what you have shown. Maybe we have time for one more thing, and then think about in a post recording session of whether or not it makes sense to do like a second follow-up Japan version of it. Because I think like there is so much on this board that we haven't talked about yet. But
Sure.
You want to maybe dive into the kind of the definition, like contemporary Japan versus Oldenburg's version as well?
The what?
The kind of like the section on the board where you compare Oldenburg's characteristics to modern day.
Yeah. Yeah. So here on the right are the characteristics that Oldenburg used to define third places, and kind of as a summary of the last half hour or so, we could look at some of the ones that don't hold quite as true to the types of places that we discussed here in Tokyo. So one of them is the idea that a third place has a leveling effect, that we kind of all enter the space with the same status, and that enables certain types of gathering to happen, certain types of relationships to form. I think in Japan, many of these places, there is a layer of this service provider and customer relationship built into it. But I don't see this as necessarily any kind of limiter on the diversity or depth of relationships that are possible. Perhaps because in Japan, being in service of others is not seen as degrading or something that you want to graduate out of at some point in your life. Like it's an honorable position to hold, and one that many people bring a lot of pride and craft to. And I think that there's like this mutual respect that is possible within a lot of service relationships in Japan that, brings a richness to the space. Another one that we touched upon earlier is this idea that conversation is not necessarily the main activity. Maybe it's silence or solitude or privacy. But again, there's a lot of diversity and nuance there. And I think a lot of meaning possible in these spaces, even the ones that are less conversational. A lot of the places we looked at are also anonymous, or you can remain anonymous in them for a long time. There's places that I've been going to for many years where, one day I wake up and I will say, oh yeah, by the way, my name is Chris, but this is an anomaly, not something that's expected, or like that's the custom in these places. And then finally, we talked about that. Yes, I guess it is a home away from home in Tokyo as well, but a lot of it can be logistical rather than social, that it's a place where you can actually solve little problems or challenges that pop up throughout the day.
Nice. I think like Tokyo and Japan were considered the future in the 70s for Western societies. And I wonder, like, in a sense that while not maybe being the future, like certain aspects of price development and how sociality works based on just certain kind of financial restrictions might be a foreshadowing of what we can expect to happen in Western kind of cities as well, just because Tokyo has been experiencing those conditions for way longer and at much higher density. So I think that thank you so much for taking your time and walking us through what you have found about Tokyo and Japan, the place that you live in. It was super fascinating. It's certainly something that we couldn't have done without being there or living there for 23 years. So thank you.
My pleasure. This
beautiful.
was fun. Thank you.
Cool.
And with that, thank you for joining us. And if you want to follow more of our episodes, you know the shtick. Like and subscribe.
Have a good one.
Bye.